The chandeliers in La Belle Époque dripped with crystals, scattering light across polished mahogany tables and glistening silverware. It was the kind of restaurant where the air itself seemed expensive, velvet curtains muffling the outside world, hushed laughter carrying beneath the low hum of a piano. And then the doors opened. Richard Halloran, the name whispered in boardrooms and printed across business magazines, stepped inside. Billionaire, hotel mogul, ruthless dealmaker. Every eye flicked toward him, and every server straightened as though royalty had arrived. But Richard wasn't alone. At his side, holding onto the curved handle of a cane, was his son Daniel. Daniel was 17, with a sharp mind but legs that often betrayed him. The world didn't see his brilliance first. They saw the braces strapped to his knees, the careful, uneven steps, the hesitation in his gait. To his father, those details had always been a silent ache, something he tried to ignore, burying it under piles of contracts and acquisitions. They were ushered to a prime table, candles flickering against crystal glasses. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, scanning the room as though calculating its worth. Daniel, though, barely noticed the decor. His gaze had snagged on something else entirely. A group in the corner, young, carefree, laughing as music floated from the piano. They weren't dining, they were dancing. Spontaneous, clumsy, joyous. Daniel's eyes locked onto them with a longing that made Richard's chest tighten. He knew that look. He'd seen it before. Daniel wanted to join. "Eat your dinner," Richard muttered, his voice low, businesslike. "We didn't come here for distractions." But Daniel's hand trembled on the tablecloth. His fork clinked against his plate. He swallowed hard, and for a moment, Richard feared his son might cry. Here in public, in front of people who already whispered about weakness. And then she appeared. The waitress. Her name tag read Maya. She moved between tables with practiced grace, balancing trays, smiling softly at every guest as though they weren't customers but people. She noticed things. The couple celebrating an anniversary. The elderly man struggling with his coat. The teenager sitting stiffly beside a father who didn't seem to notice his longing. When she set down Daniel's plate, her eyes lingered on him. On the braces. On the way his shoulders hunched like he was shrinking beneath the weight of being watched. And she bent closer, her voice warm, conspiratorial. "You like the music?" Daniel startled, then nodded quickly, embarrassed. Maya smiled. "I do too. Sometimes, when it's quiet, the staff sneak in a dance step or two. But don't tell anyone." She winked, and for the first time that evening, Daniel's lips curved into the ghost of a smile. Richard watched, frowning. Waitresses were supposed to serve, not meddle. But Maya wasn't done. When Daniel glanced again at the dancers in the corner, she followed his gaze. And then, with a gentleness that seemed both reckless and inevitable, she held out her hand. "Want to try one step? Just one. You can lead." The words hit like a lightning strike. Daniel froze, torn between terror and yearning. His father's fork hovered midair. This was absurd. Improper. Dangerous. Richard's empire was built on control, on rules. He was about to shut it down with a sharp, cutting remark. But Daniel's trembling hand reached out, and everything in the Halloran Empire shifted. For a second, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. A billionaire's son. A waitress in an apron. A single hand extended between them like a dare to fate. Daniel's fingers hovered above hers, trembling, uncertain. His lips parted, searching for permission he'd never been given. And then, with the smallest, most fragile courage, he let his palm press into Maya's. The room didn't stop. Forks still scraped plates, glasses still clinked, but to Richard time slowed. He felt a heat rise in his chest, sharp and unfamiliar. This was not how evenings were supposed to go. Not in his world. "Daniel," Richard said, his voice a warning dressed as a name. But Daniel didn't hear him. Or maybe he did and simply chose, for once, not to obey. His braces clicked faintly as he stood, legs stiff but determined. Maya steadied him with a hand against his elbow, her smile calm, like she'd done this 100 times before. They took one step toward the open space near the corner, where the piano player lifted his brows, sensing the moment, and slid into a softer, slower tune. Daniel's first step was awkward, clumsy, heavy. But Maya matched it, as though it were the most natural rhythm in the world. She guided without controlling, nudging without pushing, letting him believe he was leading. And with each shuffle, each careful movement, Daniel's shoulders uncoiled. His face lifted. His eyes stopped darting and began to shine. The boy who had been shrinking into the shadows was suddenly visible. People noticed. Heads turned. Phones tilted. A few whispered, and some even clapped lightly, encouraging. To anyone else it looked like a tender, spontaneous dance. But to Richard, it felt like an indictment. His son, who he'd always seen as fragile, dependent, broken, was standing there, taking the lead. And it wasn't him, the father, who had made it happen. It was a waitress. Richard's jaw tightened. His instinct was to stand, to stop it before it spiraled into a spectacle. His empire had no room for vulnerability. He'd built walls, not dance floors. And yet, his legs wouldn't move. Instead, he sat, gripping the edge of the tablecloth until his knuckles whitened. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he watched his son smile. A smile he hadn't seen in years. The piano swelled. Maya spun slightly, letting Daniel guide her through a slow turn. His braces squeaked, his steps faltered, but she never let him stumble. She laughed, not at him, but with him, as though every misstep was simply part of the rhythm. The clapping grew louder. Someone whistled. A phone camera flashed. And that was when Richard felt it, shame. Not at Daniel. Not at the scene. But at himself. How many times had he shut down his son's attempts at joy, telling himself it was for Daniel's own protection? How many times had he buried his own discomfort in stock reports and quarterly gains, convincing himself that money could substitute for presence? He'd spent his life measuring value in profits and losses. But here, in front of him, his son was being given something priceless: dignity. Courage. A taste of freedom. And it hadn't come from him. The billionaire, who could buy anything, had never thought to give his son this. Richard's throat tightened. He sipped his wine, hoping to drown the sensation, but it clung, bitter, like a truth he couldn't unhear. When the song ended, the restaurant broke into gentle applause. Daniel bowed slightly, cheeks flushed with pride. Maya patted his hand before guiding him back to his seat, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had. Richard looked at her differently now. Not as staff, not as a servant, but as someone who had just, in the span of 3 minutes, dismantled the walls he had built around his life. And that terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever could. The applause faded, silverware clinked again, and the piano drifted into something light and forgettable. To the room, it was over. A sweet interruption, nothing more. But Richard couldn't move on. He sat there, hands clasped too tightly, staring at his son, flushed, alive, different, and his mind betrayed him, dragging him backward. Richard Halloran hadn't always been stone. Once, long ago, he was just another boy from a working-class neighborhood, scraping by. His father worked double shifts at the steel mill. His mother cleaned houses. Money was short, but there was laughter. His mother used to sing while she scrubbed floors, her voice filling their tiny kitchen, her apron dusted in flour. And then she got sick. Too sick to sing. Too weak to work. The hospital bills came faster than his father's paychecks. Richard remembered the look in his father's eyes. A man breaking under numbers on paper. Pride turned to shame. Their small home slipped away, piece by piece, until they were living out of a friend's spare room, his father hollowed out by debts he couldn't pay. Richard swore then, never again. Never would he be at the mercy of luck or pity. Never would he watch someone he loved suffer, because he couldn't afford more. So he clawed. Through college. Through mergers. Through ruthless deals where he cut throats before they could cut his. The boy who once had nothing became the man who had everything. But in the process, something in him calcified. Laughter felt frivolous. Music a distraction. He measured every moment in what it produced, what it earned. Even love became transactional. His marriage had collapsed years ago under the weight of his schedule, and when Daniel was born, Richard loved him, but with the fear of a man who couldn't stand weakness. And Daniel, with his fragile legs, his braces, his hesitations, felt like weakness incarnate. So Richard protected him the only way he knew how. By controlling him. By shutting doors. By steering him away from anything that might remind the world, or himself, of fragility. He told himself it was love. But sitting there, watching his son glow from a single dance step, Richard felt the lie unravel. A clatter snapped him back. Maya had returned, clearing plates, her eyes flicking politely toward him. Richard studied her. She couldn't have been more than 26, maybe 27. Tired eyes, calloused hands, but a gentleness that seemed unbreakable. She didn't know it, but she had just reached into the cracks of his empire and touched the boy he buried beneath all the marble and steel. And Richard hated and envied her for it. Richard couldn't leave it alone. The applause had ended, but the moment clung to him like smoke. He needed to put things back in their box. The son small and protected, the waitress invisible, the world orderly. So when Maya circled back to the table with the check, he leaned forward, voice low, sharp. "You overstepped." She froze. Her hand tightened slightly around the leather folder. "Sir, you don't pull my son into displays. You don't make him into a spectacle." His tone was clipped, rehearsed, the same one he used in boardrooms when reminding junior partners who held the power. Maya didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eye, calm, steady. "I didn't make him into anything. He did that himself." Richard's jaw tightened. No one talked to him like that, especially not staff. But before he could reply, Daniel cut in. His voice was small but firm. "Dad, I wanted to. She just helped." That stopped him cold. His son, timid, deferential Daniel, was contradicting him, defending her. Maya turned back to Daniel, softening. "You led beautifully. You should be proud." Daniel's smile cracked something in Richard. It was fragile, like glass under pressure. He realized with a jolt that his son wasn't embarrassed. He was radiant, stronger than he had ever allowed him to be. And all Richard could think was, "I almost crushed this." The car ride home was silent, except for Daniel humming, the same melody the pianist had played. Richard gripped the wheel, his thoughts louder than the road. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the man in control. That night, he couldn't sleep. He found himself pacing his study, staring at the family portraits on the wall. In each one, Daniel sat stiff, unsmiling, like he was posing for someone else's life. Richard saw it now, saw the hollowness he'd mistaken for obedience. And then he thought of Maya's words. He did that himself. The billionaire who thought he held every key realized he'd been the lock all along. The next evening, Richard returned to the restaurant. Alone. The staff stiffened when they saw him, but Maya approached, towel tucked at her hip, cautious but unafraid. "Back for dinner?" she asked. "No," Richard admitted, surprising even himself. His voice was softer, stripped of its usual armor. "Back to thank you." Her brows lifted. She waited. "You gave my son something I couldn't," he said. "And you reminded me of something I forgot." He exhaled, a breath that had been waiting decades to leave. That life isn't about control. It's about letting them dance. For the first time in a long time, Richard Halloran smiled. Not the tight-lipped grin of a man sealing a deal, but something human. Maya only nodded, like she'd known all along that the dance wasn't just for Daniel. Months later, whispers spread. The billionaire, who never left his skyscraper office, was suddenly showing up at Daniel's therapy sessions. He was seen at fundraisers for disability access, cutting checks not for prestige, but for ramps and programs. And at one gala, Daniel, braces gleaming under the lights, took the stage. He asked Maya to join him, and together they danced again, this time before hundreds. Richard watched from the front row, eyes wet, unashamed. For the first time, the empire he'd built wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in steps. In freedom. In a boy who finally got to lead.